Greetings everyone and welcome back to another episode of Fanfic Read-Through. I am Tsubaki94 and I'm reading my own fanfic. Here we are at the big finale and the end of the story, which are leading up to the next story. Like in the life, everything builds upon what came before and gives new possibility to what will come after. That is my thinking when writing these stories and they are coming to an end. Because when I reach the end, I always find something new I want to write about or want to continue the story, just like I'm continuing the story of Danny Phantom, which was cancelled over a decade ago. And isn't that the essence of fanfic and fan work? To continue something that stopped, or to build on a world that one loves. I hope you will enjoy the end. This is the end of the story, not the end of the series. Hell's Trip, Chapter 17, and the Epilogue, Chapter 18. Valerie had been on her normal patrol, seeing as Phantom hadn't been seen the last couple of days. Though to be honest, there hadn't been any ghost attacks the last couple of days, except for the box ghost, trying to make a fuss at her work. Well, that and the Wisconsin ghost, Vlad Plasbius, or Vlad Master, which he was also known as in his human form, who had decided to pay her a visit. She was pretty certain that Vlad didn't know she knew who he was, and had played along when he attacked her. He had come from behind, her warning system giving her a heads up when he tried to blast her off her hoverboard, making it easier for her to avoid his attack. Twisting, Valerie fired a shot at Plasmius with a trusted bazooka. She hadn't expected to hit, and the ghost avoided her shot easily. "Got tired of hiding, did you?" she shouted at him, firing another blast of anti-ghost explosives. Plasmius slapped the explosive aside like an annoying fly. "Really? And here I thought you were the one hiding," he said, and suddenly started gaining on her. Turning forward, Valerie increased her speed, trying and failing to outrun the ghost. He glided past her and stopped in front of her, forcing Valerie to stop or smash into the vampire-looking ghost. "What you want, ghost?" she growled, venom dripping from her words as she raised her bazooka to point at Plasmius. "First, to disarm you," Vlad said calmly, and slowly seemed to fade, leaving only his smile hovering in front of Valerie. "Then I'm going to take your suit." Valerie's proximity alarm suddenly went off, and she twisted around to see who was coming at her from behind, only to get a face full of pink ghost energy that knocked her off her hoverboard, making her drop the bazooka at the same time. Keeping herself calm as her heart was racing in fear, Valerie pressed the call button on her left arm. Through the cracked pieces of her visor, she could see Vlad grab for her hoverboard and miss as it flew towards her. Many hours of practice allowed her to place her feet back on the hoverboard and fly up into the air before she was even close to hitting the ground or any of the buildings. Lifting her arm, she fired a wrist ray at Plasmius. He avoided the blasts and then fired his own ghost ray at her. Feeling annoyed, Valerie avoided the rays of pink ghost energy, wishing that her shield hadn't broken that summer, or it could have protected her from the blast. Instead, she had to avoid it and run away from Vlad. After exchanging a couple of more blasts, Valerie changed tactic. Turning away from the open air where Plasmius had the advantage, she flew down in between the buildings, relying on her suit's abilities and her reflexes to avoid flying into walls. Somehow, no matter how much she tried, she couldn't get Plasmius off her tail. Every time she turned a corner, he was there waiting for her. She turned and flew in opposite direction, only to find him there waiting. In a desperate try to see where the ghost was, she flew up again, and her eyes widened in horror, as not just one Plasmius followed her up, but 10. "Oh, I know that look on your face," Vlad's voice said behind her, making Valerie jump and spin around to face the Plasmius behind her. "It's the look of defeat," he said, and pink ghost power smashed into Valerie once more, throwing her off her hoverboard. This time, however, Vlad gripped the board tight, and Valerie had nothing to save her from a very painful and certainly fatal fall. Doing the only logical thing she could think of, she raised her wrist rays and fired them at Plasmius, hoping that they would hit before she splashed against the asphalt of Amity Park's main road. She didn't have any luck. Plasmius just waved his hand in front of him, and a shield of pink energy absorbed her shots. "Die, you bastard!" she cried, firing her weapons all she could without any success. Something hard smashed into her left side, and suddenly she wasn't falling anymore. Looking over her shoulder, she stared into the glowing green eyes of her arch-enemy, Danny Phantom. "You just had to be the hero," she growled, angry at Phantom for treating her like a damsel in distress, and at the same time glad that he did. Unlike the normal Phantom, however, he didn't answer with any of his normal witty comments, and instead of landing gently on the flat roof of a high apartment building, they crashed onto it. Both let go of each other, rolled, and came up on their feet. "Nice landing, dummy. You lost your flying license or something?" growled Valerie, looking over at Phantom. Phantom was glaring up at the squad of Plasmius, his eyes a brilliant green, his sharp teeth bared in a snarl, sweat running down the side of his face, and his chest heaving as if he was out of breath. Valerie stared at him, for a moment stunned at the look of the ghost, who had never been out of breath in any of their fights. A slow clapping made her turn and look at the squad of lads hanging in the air meters above them. "Truly, boy, that was a beautiful catch. A second slower and I could have poured our huntress here out of her boots." Valerie shivered at the notion of being poured out of her boots, like a smashed egg. "You know, I wouldn't let that happen," Phantom said, his voice hoarse and gravelly. To Valerie's surprise, Plasmius' face looked concerned for a moment before the vampire's smile hid it. A sphere of pink ghost energy gathered at the palm of Plasmius' hand. "I figured you'd say that. That's why I prepared a little gift for you," he said, and all the Plasmius were now gathering power in their hands. "Let's see if you can protect everyone from this." He smiled, and all the Plasmius turned in different directions, like a baseball pitcher throwing the spheres of energy at different targets. Valerie could see the pink spheres heading straight for a couple walking on the streets below. Before she could do anything more than turn, Phantom was off, flying faster than she had ever seen him before. Swallowing hard, Valerie turned to Plasmius. "You monster!" she growled, and fired her wrist ray at him, clipping two of his clones. Plasmius didn't waste any time. He scattered when Valerie fired her second round. But instead of using his ghost rays to tear her apart, he came at her with his fists. Valerie had reached the rank of black belt in karate, and had been training martial arts whenever she had time the last 2 years. Her skills were only surpassed by Miss Fenton when it came to fighting hand to hand. She kept her arms up, blocking and deflecting Plasmius' strikes. Arms hurting after only 2 of the ghost's hits, she gritted her teeth. Deflecting the strikes was harder, and she couldn't stay still for a moment, or Plasmius would hit her, somewhere that really hurt. Doing her best to follow the different Plasmius movements, she wondered what was taking Phantom so long, and then scolded herself for expecting him to save her again. She could handle herself. She wasn't a damsel in distress. In the small moment of distraction, Plasmius got a hand under Valerie's helmet and tugged. Valerie had to twist and draw her head out of it. She dodged as a second Plasmius tried to hit her in the back. Spinning around, she hit that Plasmius' head with a sweeping move, sending him tumbling to the ground, where he disappeared. She didn't get a second chance to kick Plasmius in the face. As she struggled to keep them away from her, one of them got in under her guard, and his hands closed around the throat. "I've had enough of this little dance, miss. It's time you give me what I want," he hissed, his face too close for comfort. "Get off!" snarled Valerie, her words barely understandable, as she smacked her fist into Vlad's face and arm, doing everything she could to break his hold. Plasmius just kept smiling down on her as her vision started to blur, and a whistling noise drowned out all the sounds around her. Feeling her arms lose their strength, she squirmed under Plasmius, not sure when they'd hit the roof. Her vision started to go dark, and then a streak of brilliant green light shot through her field of vision, and suddenly she drew in gulps of air. Blinking her eyes, she could see the white hair and glowing green eyes of Phantom in front of her. She swallowed, and he smiled tiredly at her. "I know the feeling," he said in that hoarse voice again, and glared up at Plasmius above them, his eyes calculating. It wasn't before then that Valerie noticed the green dome-shaped shield around them, keeping the other ghost out as they bombarded it with ghost rays. "They'll break through in no time," said Valerie, thinking out loud, her words hurting her throat. Phantom nodded, and suddenly the temperature in the air dropped. Valerie saw her own breath in front of her, and made a double take, seeing the ghost boy's eyes glow an icy blue instead of the normal greens. He dug in one of the pockets on his belt and pulled out 2 small devices. "Put this on," he said, giving the earpieces to Valerie. Accepting the things, she recognized them as being made by the Phantoms. Putting them in her ears, she wondered, not for the first time, what Phantom's connection with the Phantoms were. Meeting Valerie's eyes, he closed his, and the dome shield fell. At the same time, eyes formed around them, snapping up in a dome form to Valerie's confusion. Phantom placed his hands over her ears, taking a deep breath. He glared up at Plasmius, who were doing their best to break the ice. The moment he opened his mouth, Valerie understood why he had covered her ears. She had heard the ghostly wail a couple of times before, but had always attributed it to a nasty ghost Phantom was fighting, and never to Phantom himself. Wondering why he had enclosed him in the ice dome, she looked up and blinked at the large ice construction above them. "A loudspeaker!" she exclaimed, wincing at the pain in her throat. She wasn't a star student at Casper High, but Valerie remembered the lesson on sound waves and the experiments they had done creating their own speakers, as well as taking apart a loudspeaker to see how it worked. The dome Phantom had created around them was the voice coil, and she could recognize the form of the frame, as well as the cone, that all produced and amplified the sound waves of Phantom's wail. However, the ice construction wasn't perfect, and Valerie wondered what Phantom had been thinking, expecting it to withstand his wail, but when it finally shattered under his voice, she couldn't see a trace of Plasmius in the sky. Phantom's wail whined down and turned into a cough. He released Valerie's ears and pressed a hand against his chest and mouth, coughing. It was like being slapped with pure fire. One moment she was pushing herself up, the next a blast of pink energy hit her in the side and sent her rolling over the roof. Gasping for air and coughing, she glared up at the last Plasmius. Standing disheveled at the opposite end of the roof, his normal horn-like hair was flowing around him as his red eyes burned with anger. And then there was that concern in his face again, as his eyes landed on Phantom. Following his gaze, Valerie couldn't help but stare. White light was moving over the hunched-over form of Phantom, changing his black and white jumpsuit to a pair of blue boxers and a grey t-shirt that had seen better days. The boots and gloves disappeared, leaving only bare scratched skin, and when the hair changed color, Valerie's heart missed a beat. Fighting back the darkness that was closing in at the corner of her eyes, Valerie watched Plasmius walk over to the curled-up form of Danny. Bending down, he pushed the fringe out of Danny's face and gently placed a palm against it. The sound of blood rushing past her ears drowned out much of the sound, but she could hear Vlad curse before he picked up the unconscious boy and slung him over one shoulder. "I'm sorry, dear, but we have to cut this encounter short," Vlad said, all the manners of a gentleman back. "Till we meet again, keep that suit of yours safe for me, will you?" He smiled, turned and flew off with one of the few friends Valerie still had hanging over one shoulder. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Epilogue. The fire Dana had been fighting ever since he'd left the hospital that Friday engulfed him. It shattered his thoughts as it burned through his body. Gasping for air, he felt like he was drowning, all his enemies laughing at him, as if he was some kind of a caged animal at a zoo. Trying to blast them out of his sight, he found his hands bound to his back. "Ain't that tough now, ghost child?" Skulker said, leaning forward to place a dagger at Danny's throat. Doing the only thing he could do, he launched forward and bit down on Skulker's arm. The salty irony taste of blood filled Danny's mouth as he stared into the bloody face of Sam lying on the forest floor, his teeth digging deep into her neck. Jerking away, he scrambled as far away from her as he could. A jolt of pain made Danny scream. Looking down at his leg, he saw the cursed Ripper Ghost's sword digging into it. "No, no, no," he whined. "Get it out, get it out, get it out!" He screamed the last word as he tasted the sickly sweet fear. His eyes going all around, looking for someone to help him, but there was no one left alive. Standing in the middle of the misty street, he saw everyone he'd ever cared about lying on the ground. Tucker was missing his arm. Valerie was lying on either side of him. Sam's lifeless eyes were still on Danny's, a look of surprise on her face. "Well done," said Vlad, stepping over the fallen form of Danny's dad, the big man's head in Vlad's hand. "I'm proud of you, my son." "No!" screamed Danny, releasing the cold ice power within his chest. turning the misty street into a frozen landscape, freezing Vlad in a block of ice. Turning his head left and right, he recognized the far frozen. "Frostbite!" he called out, shivering in the sudden cold. There was no answer, only the whisper of wind, sounding like the voices of everyone he'd been too late to save. "Frostbite!" he called again, more desperate this time. But only the moaning wind answered, whispers of everything he should have done, how he should have saved them. His selfishness had cost them their livelihood, their happiness, their loved ones, their lives. "I'm sorry!" he cried, covering his ears to stop them, but it didn't help. They were still talking. "I'm sorry! I'm sorry! I'm sorry!" He kept sobbing, falling to his knees in the snow. The fire returned, melting the ground under him. He didn't try to crawl away as he sank deeper into the white ground, wishing for the voices to stop. But why should they? Then he twisted around in the darkness. Why should they? Isn't it tasty? Their misery? Their pain? "Who are you?" Danny shouted, but a horrible feeling in the pit of his stomach told him he already knew who it was. "Whoever you are, get out of my head! I don't want you!" His voice quivered and rose an octave. The silhouette of a thin teenager appeared in front of him. "But you do. You just haven't realized it yet," the voice giggled. "Shut up!" Danny roared back. Placing a foot in front of him, he twisted his whole body and swung his fist with all his strength behind it at the figure. The satisfying feeling of his fist connecting and breaking through its target exhilarated him. Looking at the figure, however, made him feel sick. He wasn't thin, but well-muscled, broad-shouldered, and wearing a varsity jacket over a black t-shirt that was covered in blood. The only thing left of his head was the blonde hair. "One down! Who's next?" giggled the voice in Danny's ears. Twisting around, Danny swung a second blow at whoever was behind him, and something snapped. Dull, light blue eyes stared down at Danny. He was breathing heavily, and it felt like his heart was trying to beat out of his chest. Gasping for air, he blinked up into the familiar face of Vlad Master. Though he had never looked at the man's face that closely, dull blue eyes, a straight nose, sharp cheekbones, and small scars from acne covered his cheeks. He sported a galaxy-colored bruise on the right side of his face, and a grey beard decorated his chin. Danny's left arm was shaking, and he let it fall to his side as he took in the surrounding. He was lying in a four-poster bed, with the drapers covering two sides of the bed. The sides he could see out of showed only a comfortable armchair and a small tea table with a cup and an open book on it. Water rolling down the dark windows behind the chair. Vlad was standing on the bed over him, his left knee pressing on Danny's right thigh, a steady source of pain. His left hand was pressing down Danny's right arm above his head. Something stinging there as well, and when Danny looked, he saw an IV needle sticking out of his arm. The tube was disappearing behind his head. Vlad's right hand was pressing on Danny's left shoulder, but it hadn't stopped him from striking the man in the side. "What?" Danny began, and stopped. His throat felt like someone had burnt it. Remembering some of his dreams, he wasn't sure that someone hadn't. "Have you calmed down?" Vlad asked, relaxing his grip on Danny a bit. Danny looked at him confused. Raising an eyebrow, Vlad slowly let go of Danny's arm and shoulder. When Danny didn't move, he straightened and drew in a sigh of relief. "So you have finally come back from the dream world, little badger." "What do you mean?" Dan asked in a barely audible whisper, pushing himself up on his elbows. "Can you get off my leg? It hurts," he added when Vlad showed no sign of moving. Lifting his knee from Danny's leg, he sat down on the side of the bed, eyes moving over Danny's face. He nodded. "What was the last thing you remember?" he finally asked. Blinking at Vlad, Danny searched his muddled memories. He could remember fighting a horde of plasmius. He could remember the agony in his chest when he transformed, and flying faster than he'd ever done to save people, and the bitter regret when he saw what happened to the ones he'd been too late to save. Anger flared up in his chest, and he glared at Vlad. "Ah, you remember the fight, I see." Something like regret flickered over Vlad's face, but was immediately hidden by the fatherly concerned look he often reserved for Danny. "Do you remember our talk at the hospital?" Vlad asked, and leaned forward, reaching above Danny's head. Following the arm with his eyes, Danny saw a night table holding bottles of different kinds, a pitcher of water, and a half-full glass. Handing him the glass, Danny was surprised at how weak he felt. His hands were shaking too much for him to drink without spilling some of the water. "I remember our conversation. What of it?" he said after he drained the glass, wiping his chin with the back of his hand. "I was just wondering, seeing as you didn't do as I instructed," Vlad said, taking the glass from Danny's hands and putting it on the table again. "I did. I didn't even go ghost under the entire weekend," Danny sighed, lying back down against the soft pillows. He was acutely aware that he wasn't wearing anything, and only the thin linen sheet covering his waist and hips kept him from turning red with embarrassment. Vlad shook his head. "That's not what I mean," he sighed. "Did you use your ice powers to counteract the fever?" he asked, in a concerned sort of voice. Danny shrugged. "So what if I did? I hate being sick." "You stubborn, ignorant," Vlad pushed up from the bed. "Egotistical, suicidal, childish, hero complex idiot." He walked back and forth and suddenly turned to face Danny again. "The fever burns out the poison. I told you so. Instead of your own immune system taking weeks to purge you of it, it will burn it all out in a span of days." He combed back his hair with his fingers. "Using the ice powers of yours just made it meaningless. Do you understand? If I hadn't been there when you collapsed, you could be dead right now." "I'm already dead," Danny responded, not meeting Vlad's eyes. Vlad took 2 steps forward and slapped Danny across the face. "Don't you ever say that. You're more alive than most humans." Danny closed his eyes. "Where's Mom and Dad?" he asked, not feeling like being lectured by Vlad. "I imagine that they are talking to social services right now," Vlad said in a calm tone, a stark contrast to the one a second before. "They're what?" Dan exclaimed, sitting bolt upright. "Why?" Vlad turned so that Danny could only see him in profile. "Because I found you, sick and alone, out in the cold, with no sign of your parents at home. I was obligated to call social services to report the neglect of a minor, as well as the signs of abuse I could see on you." Vlad looked very pleased with himself, and raised an eyebrow at Danny, as if daring him to do anything. "This was your plan all along," Danny growled, his voice lower and threatening, eyes glowing green. Shrugging, Vlad turned to face Danny. "No, but it was a possible outcome, one that I wouldn't stop to seize the advantage of. You'll be removed from their care for the duration of the inquiries." Danny flung himself out of the bed towards Vlad, and something sharp cut into his left ankle, making him fall flat on his face instead. Groaning, Danny looked up to see a pair of handcuffs digging into his ankle, the other end attached to the bedpost. Feeling too many emotions to be able to deal with the frustration, he didn't even try to get up. Tears filled his eyes, and he bit his lip to stop any sound from escaping from them, as he just lay there, his whole world turning on its side. A strong hand gripped Danny under the arm and lifted him back into bed. Danny turned his back on Vlad and curled in on himself. The man picked up the linen sheets and put it over the hurting boy. "Someone once said, 'That which does not kill us makes us stronger.'" He pushed Danny's fringe out of his face. "They will be here tomorrow to collect you. Rest now. I'll be here if you need anything." Vlad turned back to his armchair, in which he had been keeping vigil over the boy. Picking up his book again, he listened to the sound of rain hitting the window, the steady dripping sound of the ivy hanging above the bed, and the steady heartbeat of the crying boy. When he thought Dan had fallen asleep, the boy spoke. "Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher from the mid-19th century." Vlad blinked and then smiled. A year ago, he was sure Danny couldn't name any single historical figure apart from Neil Armstrong, and now he was proving him wrong. End of chapter 18. This has been Hell's Trip, the 3rd story in the series I Am Danny Phantom Through It All. Thank you for listening.